Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever you are in the world. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today. And it is actually a very, very exciting day, and we have a very, very exciting topic to discuss. And just to repeat the same word again, I'm very excited about the speakers we've brought together. I'll try not to take too much time from them, and every minute you can get from them is and from their expertise will be actually much more valuable than anything I can say. But just in case somebody sends you this link and you don't know exactly where you are, well, coming back to the topic, if you're here, I think you already know at least a bit about climate change and climate reporting, climate communications, and so on. As newsrooms around the world start awakening to the need of covering this very extensive, very intersectional topic, we are coming to the realization as a profession that we need a lot of different skills. Traditionally, at least in my experience and experience of many of my colleagues, it's not always like this, but very often, environmental or science reporters have taken over coverage of climate change. And that is a good start, but I think it's just a partial view and gives just a partial view of climate change. Climate change, it is an environmental story, but it's also a political story. It's an economic story, a social justice story. It's a health story. Is as I said, it's a transversal phenomenon, and traditional structures of media are often, I think, struggle to contain such a wide topic. So from those traditional media like beats such as environmental science, often they don't use, often, not always again, but often it's not traditional to use investigative tools to cover their bits. So today we're going to be looking at climate coverage from another point of view. As I said, while investigative reporting is common in bits such as politics or economics, I mean common. It should be a bit more common, but at least, I think you know what I mean. We often fail to see climate change as a story that we could apply traditional investigative tools and techniques. After all, the coverage we often see and the times when climate change takes over the media worldwide is when there are either disasters like natural disasters, huge diplomatic summits, or some big scientific papers. And so these three events or happenings are often difficult to cover from an investigative point of view, or not. We are not used to seeing from there. But actually, this story is actually a great subject for investigation, and it's also a particularly, I think, like a fertile field for investigative reporting, because there is so much to uncover, and it is so crucial and so important that we as journalists uncover these elements, because we are in the middle of a transition to a new model, whatever that model is, and this this transparency and this communication is key to ensure justice, fairness, and equality in this transition. So I will now shut up and let the people who know about this actually speak. So to talk about this today, we have three fantastic guests. Let me say again, I'm super excited. And believe me when I say that it's an honor to introduce you to Marina, Aizen, Neela, Banerjee, and Madhu. I will start with Marina, and I will now read their bios. Marina Aizen is a journalist from Argentina. She's in Buenos Aires at the moment. She's a co-founder of Periodistas for Planeta, and she's former correspondent for Clarín, which is the largest newspaper in her country. She was a correspondent in New York. She's been a feature writer for Viva magazine, and she has written 2 books, Contaminados and Tramplandia. Contaminados is environmental topic, and Planeta is about the US. She has received several national and international awards, including the UN Correspondence Association Award for the environmental coverage. As I said, she co-founded Periodistas for Planeta to enhance the conversation on the future of the planet for Spanish-speaking audiences, and she currently writes for Amphibia magazine. Neela Banerjee, our second speaker, is a supervising climate editor at National Public Radio. That's, you may know as NPR. Neela is the first ever supervising climate editor. She's tasked with working across the newsroom to lead network's broad climate coverage. Before that, Neela has spent 5 years as senior correspondent at Inside Climate News, which I think you probably all know, but if you don't, you can now write that down because it's an important outlet to follow climate news and key one to get excellent climate reporting. Well, there she led the team that revealed how Aizen had conducted its own ambitious climate research as far back as the mid-1970s. The Aizen project spurred public interest lawsuits, won more than a dozen National Journalism Awards, and was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Reporting. Neela began her journalism career at the Wall Street Journal, where she served as a Russia correspondent. She grew all over the US, but mostly in Southeast Louisiana, and she's a graduate of Yale University. And finally, Matt Hope, who I've known for a few years already, and one of my favorite people in climate reporting worldwide. He is the editor of DeSmog, the DeSmog UK. DeSmog is an investigative independent outlet based in the US and the UK, and he leads the coverage in the UK site. He became the editor of DeSmog in 2017, and previously he worked for Carbon Brief, which again, same as with Inside Climate News. If you don't know Carbon Brief, let's go and search that one because it's an important one. And Nature Publishing Group. Okay, you probably know Nature as well as one of the largest, or the largest science and most respected science magazine in the world. He has a PhD in climate change communications from the University of Bristol in the UK. And now I will shut up. We'll start with Marina, then we'll move to Neela and then Matt. At the end, we'll have plenty of time for questions and for debate. If you have any questions, you can send it in the chat to one only user, that is Climate Tracker, that is my colleague Nizan. And at the end, we'll come back to all of the questions or as many as we can. And now, finally, I will honor my word and shut up. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar and to talk along with these amazing people that I really admire a lot. Okay, so what does it mean to be an investigative journalist? Does it mean to expose power and corrupt companies? Well, yes, but not always. My career did not take me into that brave direction, a path that I really admire, but does not come to me naturally. Instead, what investigative journalists took me to is to challenge dominating narratives, the very narratives that are pushing my country and indeed the world into the climate crisis. I also devoted a big chunk of my work to explaining complex phenomena that is not clear to the naked eye. For instance, one of the questions to which I dedicated my career to was to figure out why there was so much pollution in a river in Buenos Aires called the Riachuelo. To answer that, I had to explore all levels of society, and that taught me a lot. I started covering climate change a long time ago, even before the Rio conference in 1992. But then I forgot all about it. I thought, as many did at the time, that it was a distant danger, not a present one. And then I went to see a glacier in Patagonia, the Ventisquero Negro, and I could not recognize it because it had shrunk so much. Then I remember about climate change. And I swore you, from that day on, that was a topic of my life. Many years later, I was invited to Greenland. And oh my God, the scale of the destruction that I saw there moved me forever. The first hurdle for any environmental journalist begins in the newsroom. And many of you will know this from first-hand experience. In my country, where we do not have climate deniers like the ones in the Republican Party, we have another experience instead. We have a dominating narrative that is at least 100 years old that considers oil and gas as a synonym for a development, a good development. And then we have something else, an active disinterest, I underline it, on current environmental topics. People that cannot see that the curve is bending, that the wave is about to break. That very old man's mindset can become a very powerful tool that the boss can use to try to discourage any curious journalist. I have received many types of answers when I propose ideas with environmental angles to my different bosses. The most common one was that if the environment was my hobby, it needed to be left out from the newsroom. My last boss at Viva Magazine, the Sunday magazine of Clarín, the largest in Argentina at the time, was even more brazen. I prefer to pave the entire Amazon rather than letting you write something that is going to happen within 75 million of years, he would say, and I am quoting. Sometimes this type of comments came as jokes, sometimes as harassment, although it took me a while to see it like that. Other times, the macho culture took over the entire newsroom. As I was entering the office, a choir of male voices began saying, "The climate death just walk in." Sounds crazy, right? But it happened not only to me. A version of the same story happened as well to my colleagues in Periodistas por el Planeta, the NGO that I, together with other journalists of different media, founded to be able to live our toxic working environment. So my first lesson to give to you here is this: don't let your bosses discourage you. Climate change, as Santiago said, is the mother of all stories. It is a story of not only the physical impacts of our civilization in the atmosphere, it is the story of a power struggle, a struggle that goes from the economy to the mind itself, a story that crosses society as a whole, that touches our bodies. It's political, very political. So when you're writing or broadcasting about climate change, you're also facing a monster. You have to know that. And you have to know that you are going to be hated by some, from the people that don't want any change in society to the very powerful. Don't let them scare you. The first duty of an investigative reporter is to connect the dots. In order to do that, you have to become an avid reader. One of the areas I am working on is deforestation in the Chaco region, the second largest forest in the Americas after the Amazon. In order to do that, I have to talk to scientists in Argentina and abroad, read reports of big international NGOs, talk to them, interview experts on international commerce, also people on the ground. It is very, very, very important to come up with different and compelling angles. To be able to attack the narrative of the very powerful, to challenge minds, we have to be thorough. We have to know the facts in our own countries and abroad. We must connect with local communities. We have to be sensitive to their demands. We have to listen. We have to have empathy for the suffering, and we have to tell the story with beauty. We don't have the luxury to bore our readers or our listeners. We have to be engaging. So as important as digging the facts is to be a good storyteller. Remember, we are up to changing narratives. We have to do it the right way. And above all, we have to be credible. Never, ever accept money from an oil company. Never take money from a mining company or from big agro. In the global south, money comes from huge conglomerates in many forms. For instance, advertising for a radio or TV program. Sometimes this company invites you to very expensive trips. They may even try to bribe you. So, call out the green bullshit. Don't be fooled by the word sustainability or the phrase net zero that nowadays is used even by big oil. You have to be able to catch the oxymorons in the narrative of these big companies. For instance, in my country, the Canadian companies advertise sustainably mining as a good thing, and the government officials repeat this phrase without even thinking. We have to be constantly aware of the language of these companies, the media, and even that society employs when talking about environment or dirty activity. Horrible things can be normalized with words and language structures. We can't repeat things acritically. The language trap is dangerous. Refuting narratives, the narrative tricks, goes to the very essence of our work. My advice to you is this: be disciplined, be constant, be patient, keep your reputation clean. You will harvest the fruits of your work. Remember, you are a journalist. You have a very powerful weapon, the ability to ask questions. Keep asking them. Be defiant. Don't be afraid. We know that we are right and history is in our side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina. That was super inspiring. I've been taking lots of notes. Just to remind you that we will be posting this session in probably next week in our YouTube channel. And we will also post a web post with some of the quotes that you will hear here, some of the materials. We'll try to summarize the main lessons in a very short PDF that you will be able to download and keep with you. Obviously, the best way is to actually be here. So I'll pass the floor now to Neela Banerjee from NPR. Neela, floor is yours.
Thank you for having me today, and I'm very excited to talk to all of you and to see the representation of journalists from so many different countries. That's really inspiring for somebody like me, and I think that what I'm going to talk about actually echoes some of the things that Marina said. It really, climate reporting or any kind of investigative reporting is about challenging dominant narratives in your society. And I'm now at NPR in this position, and NPR has usually covered climate change through the lens of science. And science obviously, but I am trying to build with my reporters the confidence to do stories that are investigative or that we call accountability stories. As Santiago said, the Exxon series that we did is, and the documents that we found now serve as the basis for dozens of lawsuits in this country by states and cities against oil and gas companies about the role that they played in fueling climate change. And it's those lessons that we gathered during that 8-month-long project, as well as investigations I did before Exxon and many since then, that I wanted to share with you. So to getting to the question of who is an investigative reporter, if you were the child, always bothered your parents and your teachers by asking why, and you still ask why, and when you look around, you ask, why are things the way they are? You've already taken a step to becoming an investigative reporter. There are questions in all of our countries, like, why do builders and developers keep putting up homes and offices in places that flood and will flood more often with climate change, or in areas that are prone to wildfires? Why don't government agencies do more to protect workers from the harm that heat can do to their health and their lives ultimately? And why are some neighborhoods and communities better protected from extreme weather or pollution than others? One of the things I will say is that the best people to do investigative stories are the reporters on the ground and on various beats, if you have them, if your media outlet is structured that way. You don't necessarily need to be a climate reporter, but as Marina said, you should always be reading, always be consuming information, because it touches everything. So if you cover business, farming, real estate, politics, health, you are poised to be a climate reporter and an investigative reporter. So there's a lot to do on climate and the way it intersects with just about every aspect of our lives. So let's help you do it. As Marina said, the question is why, right? So investigative reporting begins with questions. And maybe some of you ask the same questions in your communities that I just spoke about. One of the most important things about any kind of investigative reporting is organization. And I am not an organized person. I think that was like I was rebelling against my parents, but I've learned how to be more organized. So keep track of the questions that you have and gather information that illuminates aspects of those questions. Something that you've read, right? Like put it in, a Word file or a Google Doc. Just keep track of the questions and the answers that you have. And understand, be patient with yourself. That's another word that Marina used, that it might take time to get the answers, or that you may never be fully able to answer that question or get the most detailed picture that you dream of. And that's okay. That's okay. Just keep asking and keep collecting information. The second thing to remember is that not every investigative story is going to be a huge blockbuster. And that's fine. That's fine too. Your question can be focused and relatively narrow. It might be something that takes you weeks to do rather than months or years. That can still help people. So now, you're gathering information, you're thinking about these things. So then you say, this is something I want to look into. So from reading, looking around, talking to your sources, these questions have emerged. So how do you go about answering them? I understand that, reporters here, that you're at different levels of experience, so forgive me if some of this is redundant, but I'm just trying to codify it and make it understandable. So generally, there are two routes to get information for investigative reporting. And I've been surprised how some people rely on just one or the other. So the two routes for me that always braid together are people and documents. It's in talking to people that you understand the complexities of a particular situation. You get the nuance. Things, awaken your interest. If they say things that are worth digging into, ask them if there are documents that could support it. Ask them if there are other people they know who would be willing to talk to you. If they don't want to talk to you on the record, meaning their name, they don't want their names used, just, do it in a way that makes them feel comfortable. You can revisit that question with them later, but, do it in a way that makes people feel comfortable. So as you talk to people, what you're doing is you're building a web of inquiry, right? You're asking for more people that you can talk to and whether there are documents that could support what they're saying. And then when you talk about documents, ask them where you could find them. Is it online? Like in the States, we have some online archives where we can find things because stuff has been digitized and it's held by universities, so it's fairly easy to get to. Is it in archives, like in your country's national archives or city or local archives? Is it in lawsuits and therefore, depending upon your country's laws, available for you to look through in depositions and so on? Can you get it through public records requests? And then if you have the trust of your source that you're speaking to, ask them very gently if they have documents that they're willing to share with you that you could look at. Some people look at documents and they're really excited by them, and the documents give you evidence. are key for a lot of people, and they definitely give you the sort of meat of your investigation. But I'm not comfortable building my investigations just around just around documents, because the documents are not the end all and be all. They are enormously useful, but they need context and interpretation. So you need to run them by the people who provide that to you. It might be some of the people you've already interviewed in the first place. It could be independent experts who don't have a stake in your investigation. Like Marina was talking about, talking to climate scientists and maybe politicians and activists. I mean, those people, if they're not involved in your story, could provide you an independent view of the documents and the information you're finding. We did both of that in the Exxon project, and I can tell you more about that later. So understanding the context and interpretation protects you and your investigation. It really does. I just need to get a sip of water. And the reason is, especially if you find a document that you think is exciting, you might see what you want to see in that document rather than what might really be there, and that could be a fatal mistake. And then when you look at documents, the great thing is that you will see names of people, you'll see situations, and those documents will lead to more people. And so the documents and the people reinforce each other, I've found. People can lead to documents, documents can lead to people, and on, and they strengthen your story. There are a few things to remember as you're talking to people, and again, we can get into this too. A lot of the people you talk to, there'll be government officials and scientists and so on, but a lot of them will also just be regular people. Maybe people who work at government agencies, maybe residents in a community. And the way you should treat them is not the way you'd want to be treated. The way you should treat them is the way you would want your parents to be treated. Your parent, the civil servant, your parent who lives in a particular community, your parent, the engineer, right? You want to give them the same care and consideration because they're doing you an enormous service by talking to you. And I think that gets to like the professionalizing of the empathy that Marina talked about. You never burn a source, which, in our parlance in the United States means that if people spoke to you because they don't want their names to be used or anything like that, then you stick to it no matter how good it is. If they spoke to you and they said, this is for your own edification and you cannot use it at all because they'll know it's from me, you stick to it. The next phase, once you have your information, and once you start pulling it together, is find ways to organize. And we can talk later about kinds of tools we use, most of them are free, at least for part of it. Things like Trello, we've used that. It's online. We've used that for investigations at NPR and at Inside Climate. Once you've written your story or your script, fact check the hell out of it. Small things and big things, because what will happen is if you get something small wrong, like the spelling of somebody's name, your critics are looking for something to pounce on. And what they will say is, if you can't get the small thing right, how can we trust you with the big thing? And then finally ask if there are lawyers in your country who deal with freedom of the press and what's allowed and what your vulnerabilities are, if you're digitizing documents you found so you can share it in your investigation. See if people will consult with you. Sometimes they do it for free. In the States, they do it for free sometimes, and we did that with the Exxon project. That can really protect you. And then the last kind of practical thing I wanted to talk about is about your material and safety and security. Different countries have different protections for journalists. You want all of your accounts to have two-factor authentication. You want to keep changing your passwords. If you can get encryption of phone and emails, do that. Emails with your sources. If you're part of a team, emails among your team. Again, organize your material that's going to be critical to your fact checking once you get to that phase. Talk to veteran investigative journalists and to non-governmental organizations in your countries that do controversial work. Find out how they protect themselves. Talk to civil liberties lawyers. Make copies of your information and data and determine a safe place to keep them. And if you're meeting with people, always tell somebody in your life who you're meeting with, or leave that information somewhere where it can be easily accessed. We have some of those issues in the United States, like hacking into our material, some of the safety issues we don't have. But I lived in Russia and I worked with and saw what Russian journalists did. And I really understand the threats a lot of you face in your countries, and I know that There's only so far you can go, and I'm sure my colleagues will have other ideas about how you can protect yourself. And then finally, what I would say is that I'd like to return to the idea that you might never fully answer the question that you set out to answer. And that's all right. You know, you allow yourself to imagine what the ideal story is. But then consider, like, if this is the ideal story, if this is like the gold medal story, then what is a very good story? You know, the silver medal. What is a good solid story? The next level down. All of those are worth doing. All of those are worth sharing with your audience, because they depend on you to illuminate what's wrong in their society's response to climate change. So I'll just stop there and we'll take questions later.
Thank you so much, Neela. That was super interesting and very, very useful, all those tips. I'm writing them all here, and you'll have them all collected in next week. By the way, please remember that we have these sessions on different topics each month. Usually we do them around this time of the day, the last Monday of each month. So I know the next month we're planning one on the first station, and that would be quite interesting as well. So yeah, just to let you know that this is not a one-off. Matt, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, and thank you both for your comments. I mean, amazing and inspiring, and I hope I can just contribute a little bit to this as well. I actually have some slides to share, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in a second, not least because it's in no one's interest to stare at my face for 10 or 15 minutes. So let me try and get this working. Okay, hopefully that's working for everyone now. So yeah, thank you so much for the comments so far. And I mean, this is going to be my small contribution to it. In typical journalistic style, I'm going to talk quickly through the why, the what, and the how of this. So why do these investigations? What kind of investigations are there out there? And kind of a few bits and pieces about how you can go about them. You know, this isn't a session to give you the nuts and bolts necessarily, but just a couple of ideas. And in typical fashion, I'm going to kind of do this in a vainglorious way of basically talking to you about what DeSmog does, in the hope that you want to do similar sort of things. This is a broad church. This is such an important issue. I think everyone probably agrees with that. And the more people doing this kind of work, the better. In fact, one of my favorite things about doing climate journalism is it's probably the most collaborative beat I've ever worked on, right? Everyone is doing this because they care, which means that some of the competitiveness, some of the protectionism around stories that goes on other beats doesn't exist in quite the same way. So as I say, that my hope from the next 10 minutes or so is that if nothing else, it gets some ideas firing. Without further ado then, why do we do what we do? So DeSmog's editorial starting point then is pretty uncontroversial, I imagine, in this room, but it's probably not always been the case. You know, we start from the perspective that climate change is happening and humans are the main cause. You know, world leaders have promised to do something about this through the Paris Agreement or other international deals, but emissions are still going up and up and up. Simple question then, you know, the main investigative question, why? Why is this happening? Now that's a massive question, and this is kind of DeSmog's corner of investigations that we do on this. So we were set up 15 years ago, initially in North America, and we spun off in the UK about 5 years ago. And as Sandy said at the outset, I'm sort of in charge of the UK side of things. And we mainly look to expose the lobbying and greenwash by corporations and politicians around this issue. So our basic hypothesis is that the reason emissions are going up, the reason that this issue that we've known about for, you know, a long, long time now, you know, several decades now, isn't really being addressed is because there's some powerful actors slowing and obstructing action. So that's our kind of core investigative question. And anyone who we think, or any organization that we think is getting in the way of this, they're kind of a legitimate subject for our investigative journalism, essentially. In terms of the what then, what do we do? So this is just one example. This is an investigation we published last week. It's actually just one part of a much bigger investigation led by my colleague Rachel Sherrington, who I actually think is on this call. Rachel did fantastic work and fantastic research on this, looking at the bank directors, the directors on the boards of banks across 38 banks in the world. And our basic question we were asking was, you know, banks are increasingly expected to be progressive actors on climate change, you know, but we know a lot of them fund fossil fuels. We know a lot of them prop up polluting industries. So Is there any reason at the board level for that? Are there any conflicts of interest at play? Now, the simple answer is yes. We found an awful lot of climate conflicted directors. So we just published a week ago the UK specific bit, looking at the 5 banks. We're going to publish the rest as we go along. We're just getting that kind of all finished off now. But we found that for the UK, 80% of board members at the UK's 5 big banks had some sort of affiliation to what we would describe as a climate conflicted organization. So that's kind of supporting evidence for this hypothesis then, that this is one of many, many reasons why the issue of climate change isn't perhaps being addressed as quickly or as significantly as scientists say it should be. This investigation, fortunately, and wonderfully, was picked up by lots of other mainstream media, which helps to spread the word of it. DeSmog does public interest journalism. We do journalism because we believe this is an issue that should be addressed. And by other outlets picking up on this and kind of spreading the word of the work we do, that makes that more likely. It means more people see it, and it makes it more likely to be acted upon. The Independent in the UK picked it up. My colleague Rachel did a wonderful segment on the BBC World Service. AFP, the French newswire, picked up on it, and that kind of helped it go global, and got as far as the Bangkok Post. So as Sandy was kind of saying at the beginning, there's these kind of different models of journalism emerging, and DeSmog was originally set up because investigative journalism and climate journalism at the time were both really under-resourced, essentially. Investigative journalism is very, very expensive and very, very hard to do. And at the time, as now, to a certain extent, mainstream media is under an incredible financial pressure. So they were cutting their investigative journalism capacity. We were brought in somewhat to fill that gap. So we're pretty much fully philanthropically funded. We take charitable donations from major donors to basically fill that gap. And this accountability investigative work that Neela was talking about. And then that kind of spreads out through the ecosystem. And the mainstream media, they essentially get our stories for free. So it's a pretty good deal from their perspective as well. So that was just one example then of a big investigation we really did, just to give you an idea. We've done loads, basically. These are all kind of stories that have been picked up by the mainstream press for the last 12 months. So this is not an area where there's a shortage of material. That's basically all this slide is meant to be demonstrating. Whether that's looking at how social media helps to spread climate denial, whether that's uncovering people who are behind climate denial organizations, whether that's looking at the UK's financing for polluting projects abroad, whether that's looking at major donors to the main parties in the UK. It turns out a lot of them have vested interest in high polluting, high carbon industries. Whether that's looking at the UK government's policies and seeing if kind of one set of policies aligns with their climate commitments, which in the UK they're legally bound by. There's plenty of investigative questions out there. And as Neela and Marina both said, just keep asking those questions and finding different ways to ask those questions. How do you potentially go about that then? And like I say, this isn't nuts and bolts. This is just kind of some big ideas. Lots of journalists on this call. I'm sure a lot of you know this stuff, but hopefully it might be useful just to look at a little bit of it. The first thing to do, and again, both Marina and Neela have spoken about this, identify the public interest, right? So why is climate change happening is too big a question. What is causing climate change and who is responsible for it is kind of too big a question. You need to have a very, very specific thread to pull at. And as Neela mentioned, that comes from really traditional places. That tends to come from conversations. It comes from having read an awful lot, like Marina was saying, and being completely across your subject. That comes from having these conversations with sources or potential sources who will give you nuggets of information where your brain can suddenly go, hang on, that doesn't really make sense. And then you've got an investigative thread to pull. So just 3 very quick examples here, and I won't talk about them in detail. Google the headlines, you'll be able to find them, I hope. But for example, we had a source come to us and basically point out to us that there were these trade associations lobbying against a lot of the UK's air quality regulations. So we did a deep dive into these organizations and basically found this network of lobby groups lobbying against these things. And as Neela said, we both had source material and we also had documentary material to back all of this up. And this turned into quite a big investigation. That was probably about a 4-month piece of work, that one. Another one, again, just from being across your subject, that's where the middle one really came from. I'm sure you've all noticed that apparently trees are basically the answer to climate change. Everywhere you turn at the moment, there seems to be a new organization, a new company, a new person. Saudi Arabia today, for example, just coming out with what will be the world's biggest reforestation program. This doesn't really add up, that after 30 or 40 years of knowing about this problem, all of a sudden people have discovered trees are part of the solution to this, right? So alarm bells were ringing, and particularly from DeSmog's perspective, alarm bells were really ringing when the major oil companies started to get really on board with this. Now, we're totally open to the idea that nature-based solutions and trees are part of the solution to climate change. That's entirely legitimate, and the scientists say that's the case. But when you've got all of these organizations seeming to hang at a very large amount of their climate plans off the back of these, it seems like something that's probably worth interrogating and asking questions about. So that's exactly what we did. We did a deep dive into the big oil's plans. We spoke to a lot of experts. We brought very specific questions to those experts to take a look at. And we basically found that, yeah, there's a real forest fever within the big oil companies. And that at the moment, this is essentially a greenwashing exercise. Like I say, that's not saying this isn't going to be part of the solution. It's highly likely to be. But with the plans, with the vagaries they currently have, it suggests that this is more greenwash than reality. That's what our investigation found, anyway. And finally, on the last one then, it was a piece which is a bit more of a traditional kind of an analysis piece, which is during COVID-19, the UK government simply published a list of all the organizations and companies that have been given COVID bailouts. Now, we noticed a lot of those were aviation companies. Aviation companies are obviously very high polluters. So we asked the simple question, well, how can that match up with the government's climate commitments? And again, went to some experts, did some analysis, did some data crunching, and you basically find that it doesn't. It can't possibly work as a climate policy. So it's interrogating those statements, using sources, using documentary material, using data analysis tools to try and get to the bottom of that investigative question. The second thing then is to identify a subject. Now, fortunately, DeSmog can help here. We have 3 databases: an air pollution lobbying database, an agribusiness database, and our climate disinformation database, which has over 400 profiles of the organizations and people that we know have been pushing back against action over the last few decades. This is all out of our investigative journalism, where basically we've just documented it from the stories in a different way. So if you need to know about these organizations, if you're finding names of organizations coming up, well, hopefully these 3 databases will help you to understand your subject a bit more. And what these basically provide is a living history of how these organizations' perspectives have evolved on this issue. So it's important, as both Neela and Marina said, to not just take both what a source says, but also what a subject maybe says as read, right? Just because Bayer are currently saying that they're part of the climate solution doesn't necessarily disregard the 25 years of pollution that they've pumped out. And what this basically does is provide that kind of historic record. And this is just one set of resources. There's loads of great ones out there, but I just flagged these for you. So identifying your subject and knowing your subject. And then finally, going out there and investigating. So here's basically just 4 ways that you can do that. And this has been touched upon already, but just to mention quickly. Follow the money. It's probably the biggest investigative cliche there is, but it really is true and it really works. Money kind of makes the world turn around, and it's probably one of the strongest investigative angles you're going to find. For example, we did an investigation into the churches in the UK who have a big divestment pledge to remove all their money from fossil fuel investments. And we basically found that they still had tens of millions of pounds invested in those fossil fuels. So they're saying one thing, and we did the data crunching and found another. We followed the money. Identifying the power networks. So understanding, as I say, who is obstructing this issue. So we do investigative stories, identifying these lobbying networks, identifying who and how they get access to and how they get that access to try and develop a picture of why this action is so slow moving. Interrogate the greenwash. Major companies now, it's very hard to find one that doesn't say climate change is real, doesn't say they care about it. Most of them are very explicit in their marketing about that. But they deserve interrogation, right? So just because they're saying it, sounds obvious, just because they're saying it doesn't make it true. So get out there and interrogate it. You can do that by talking to experts. You can do that by talking to sources. You can do that by talking to people who work within the company or around the company. But really interrogating these claims, it drives me mad when I see uncritical news reports reporting essentially PR puff pieces from these companies, particularly pesticides companies, as was in this investigation, or fossil fuel companies, which doesn't really interrogate the fact that they have several decades of not really telling the truth to account for in that news reporting. So get out there and interrogate the claims. And the final one, and Neela spoke a lot about this, so I won't say too much on it, but if you have a whistleblower, I mean, that's amazing. The important thing as Neela said with that, is you can't base an entire story on what one person says. It needs backing up. So this story that Justin Nobel did for us, it was a wonderful story. It was about 18 months worth of work, start to finish. So from meeting the whistleblower and getting the contact, to getting them to provide us with all the documentary evidence, to us then verifying independently all of the stuff that the source was saying to us, getting a second source, getting expert opinion, going through this whole process. If we had just published what he had said to us, after that first meeting, the story would have looked, similar but different. It's really important you're going out there and you're doing the legwork to verify that. And as Neela said, the whistleblower, the source isn't the story. You've got to understand the importance and the implications of what they're saying, and you've got to make that stand up. So as I say, that was a massive piece of reporting by Justin, and it was a great piece of work based off, a very traditional kind of investigative source. That's all I'm going to say for now. I hope that was interesting to people on this call. And as I say, this is such an important issue. There is so much work to be done. The more people who are doing this, the better. So this was just meant to be, from my perspective, a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the sort of things you can do. I'm always delighted to talk about ideas. So if anyone does want to discuss potential investigations on this subject, please reach out. And yeah, always happy to talk. Thank you so much.
Now, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you to the three of you. This has been incredibly inspiring and enlightening, and I've really learned a lot myself, and I'm sure everybody here has as well. I think also the three different angles and three different ways of approaching this huge story that is climate change, the three different regions that you guys come from, and different models and that you use to investigate have also been extremely useful to see. We already have a few questions, so I will not take much time from those. I will just ask them. Dizan has been sending up to me, so I don't know exactly to whom they are directed, so I will just ask them, and maybe it will be obvious, and maybe we'll need some correction. If this is your question, and I'm asking to the wrong person, please just let Dizan know, and we'll just change that. All right, so the first question is from Eric Vicaire. I don't know if I pronounced your last name correctly. And the question is, at what point do you know a story is ready to pitch to your editor? How much research typically happens before you ask for time to dive deeper, write it up, and work towards publishing? I think this is a good question for any of you. There's two editors and one freelance reporter. So I think it's a very good question for any of you. I'll just give it to whoever wants to respond. How about you start, Marina? How much you take?
Well, you never know. There is not exact formula for that. You know it inside yourself when you know it's ready, because you've been reading, talking to people, checking documents, etc., etc. So when you have a headline in your mind, you know that your editor will open his mind to it. But you have to have a headline, like Exxon New, for instance. It's an excellent headline there. Then you can start pitching it. Yes.
It also depends on your relationship. I think that's really good advice. Like, what is the very quick explanation? For example, we've been speaking to, NPR has been speaking to some lawyers about a story, and I could tell when they were talking to us, it took them so long to explain what the story was that this is like, I was like, I'm not sure this is a story. But also to Marina's point, part of it is ask your editor, right? Hopefully you have a good enough relation. I've had good relationships with editors and not so good relationships, but part of it is asking, what is it going to take? Like, what do you think is needed here? What more do I need? I mean, and this is the other point that Matt made too. This shouldn't be an effort. Investigative reporting should not be an effort that you take on yourself. I think movies and stuff create this image where it's like the lone wolf journalist goes out and uncovers things that are wrong. I mean, you should be talking to colleagues and friends, maybe who are journalists. I do this all the time with journalists from other media, and try to figure out like what makes this a story. They might even have sources for you, and hopefully your editor can give you a sense of that bar that needs to be cleared. And sometimes they'll say, no, I've had stories that I worked on that other editors signed off on, and they were killed, and it sucks. And I'm sorry to say that, because as Marina was saying, the sense of like what's important is not always the same between you and your editor. And my heart bleeds for you if that's the case. But, talk to people, get their advice, and talk to your editor if you have a good working relationship with him or her.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, sorry, go on, Marina.
Please, Matt, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, let me just jump in with a little bit extra. So that's all absolutely true. And, just to jump in on that point about it not being on your own, it is a collaborative effort. We have many editors working on our stories. It's rarely just one editor who will look at it. The only thing I guess I would say is if you can explain it in 2 sentences, that's pretty important. Because as Neela says, if you go on and on an editorial meeting, no, you don't know what your story is. We're just going to ask you to go back. And then secondly, what Neela said in her talk about having a plan A, B, and C. What's the gold, silver, and bronze version of this story, right? If we're going to invest resources in this as an organization, we're going to want to know pretty sure we're going to get something. And we're very happy to invest in potential. I'm very happy to see the dream story and invest in that. But I'm going to want to know that we're likely to get something that's publishable, which will contribute to the debate. So explain it in 2 sentences, know why it's important, and know what is new. If you're hitting those 3 bases, then you're onto a winner.
Right, and what is new is that's a really good point. And then and it doesn't have to be a huge new thing. It could be incremental. But the other thing too that about what Matt was saying is that you're going to be talking to your sources, right? So you're talking to your sources, you're looking at documents, and you're going to come to that. And I think this is really interesting, but I have to clear this with my editors. So no promises. I always tell my sources, no promises, because you're being transparent with people. And that's all they want. And that's all, and frankly, that's what they deserve, right? So yeah, anyway, speaking now as an editor.
I agree with everything that everybody said, but don't be afraid to go back if you have more stuff or you have it more clear in your mind, because
Absolutely.
Sometimes you need to figure out how to communicate it. So maybe your editor forgets, and you can 2 months later you can punch him back, and you.
And one thing I will say, once your editor signs off, right? Among the best things, among the most critical things about doing an investigative project, either if you're doing it yourself or with colleagues, is to have regular check-ins with your editor at least once a week, probably more, to be giving feedback. We used to do things which was incredibly time-consuming, but ultimately helpful, on a months-long project at Inside Climate about American agriculture, big climate deniers, where my colleague and I would write up every week little summaries of our interviews with people. That way I knew what she'd heard, she knew what I heard, the editor knew what we were, it was total pain in the ass, but it proved enormously useful later. So communication, it's not just with your editor at the beginning, but throughout, and with your colleagues. Like constant communication is absolutely critical. And I hope you have editors you can do that with.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. I'll move on to the next one. This one is from Denise Alcantara, and I think she's from the Philippines. And I'm gonna ask this question not just to our 3 speakers, but to any of you who may have an answer to this question. Please send it to me over email, and I will include it in the web post and the PDF that we're gonna have published next week. The question is, Philippine news agencies usually have very little budget to do the fieldwork for investigative stories. Where else can we pitch stories, or what organizations could help fund the stories? So let's just give a couple of nuggets, and if you have any others, please send it to me, because I think it's going to be much more useful if we have a big list in a website or a PDF than just trying to remember anything. So I think the question I would reformulate, are there other organizations where people could pitch these sort of stories?
That's an excellent question, and it took me many years to figure out, and I'm still sure I have the answer or the right answer, but I know that you cannot take money from big companies. That is a no, 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 never. Unless, if, for instance, I once went to a big open pit mine in Argentina and I needed to go through them to visit the site. So, well, I had to accept the invitation to go to the, otherwise I would have never seen an open pit mine. But to criticize them afterwards and accept the criticism from them without being afraid. But otherwise it's difficult. And one of the answers we found in Argentina is by getting together with other journalists that do the same stuff that you do, a collaborative work. That was the answer for us. And pitching for grants was easier once we got together.
Yeah, I mean, in our experience, you know, obviously you need funding, like when I was at Inside Climate, to pay for people's salaries and maybe for some travel. But for the Exxon project, we did it, I mean, you know, we got everything from archives and from individuals. So that didn't cost anything except to travel to places. And fortunately, I live in Washington, D.C. and the places I traveled to were on the East Coast. And I drove, and my best friend ended up, lived near some people I met. And so I stayed with her. And so at the end of the day, it was pretty cheap. Like we didn't need to use satellites or drones or data scientists. I understand how it could be expensive, but it's not always the case. And again, not every climate story or investigative story has to be a blockbuster, right? It could be something happening down the street from you. You know, that's just not right. And you can go to your town council meetings and listen to what people are saying and what are the companies who are there who are going to be building this stuff or moving people out of these places or whatever. And it's so, I think it's the big investigations that often get our attention. Like I told you, like the big investigation we did didn't cost us a lot of money, and it's the smaller investigations in your communities that could really make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, completely agree. And just to throw a few names in as well, there are investigative journalism awards. So Birth Foundation, for example, Money Trail, these sort of organizations do give one-off bursaries and one-off grants. But I think it's really important what Neela just said, which is I think we've had a slightly wrong-headed view of what investigative journalism is, where you've got one reporter chasing one massive story for like a year, and it basically costs an organization or costs that individual an awful lot. That's not always the case. Have many eggs in many baskets. Investigative stories can be quite small as well. You know, a lot of the stories we publish on our website are little things that maybe only took a few days. I just pointed out the ones that took months because they're fun and they're good. And I want you to read them. But there can also be smaller stuff that can be happening in your doorstep as well. So an investigative story is just something where you've kind of uncovered something. It's just basically really good journalism. It doesn't have to be a year-long massive investigation that costs loads of money. So I think it's important to say that as well.
Well, thank you guys. We are exactly on the 1 hour mark for our call. We have a few more questions. I don't know if you guys are in a rush to leave. If you are, please nod and tell me yes, we're in a rush.
I'm not in a rush to leave. I'm trying to avoid meetings with other editors. So I'm...
All right, then,
I was a reporter for like 30 years until a year ago, so I'm happy to hang out with other reporters. So.
All right, so then let's stay for 5 more minutes. If anybody has to jump out, we'll have these, as I said, next week in the YouTube account and the website, so you can revisit if you have to leave. But I have a few more questions that are interesting questions. There's one for Neela here. Well, no, it's not for Neela. Neela's Exxon story was great. This is a question from Anastasia Lennon. Neela's Exxon story was great. She centered on it during grad school. And then the question is for all the panelists. Any tips for staying organized on these bigger stories? Are there certain tools, apps, strategies you use? And here I would like to say the same as before. Please, if anybody has any tips, anybody in the audience, please send them to me. You have my email in the chat right now. So please send them to me and I will include them in the web post next week. Now.
Yeah, so what, so first of all, find a coworker who is more organized than you. Like, just make sure they're really organized and learn from him or her. That's what I did. Like, I had a colleague on this ag project who's like super organized. Her home is super organized, and I just learned from her. Even though I'm the investigative reporter and she was the ag reporter, I just learned from her. But what I use personally, and I've looked at different things. Everybody's different. It kind of depends on how your mind works. But we use Trello. So Trello, I could even open up a Trello and share a screen if you guys want me to do that. I could show you what we do. But let me see if I can do that. But it's the reason we use. I'm sorry.
Yeah. We have a few more questions and not much time, so maybe.
Okay, that's fine. Anyway, Trello is great. Trello is great, and it's a really good way to keep track, especially if you have multiple people on a team. Keep track of documents, interviews, articles, reports, and it just can go on forever. So I like Trello, but again, two-factor authentication on everything.
My main advice on this would be that, to be honest, technology is not really a silver bullet to this. It helps, and Trello is great. The main thing is to have just a record somewhere. That can be a physical notepad, if you like. And in fact, if you're talking about security, that's sometimes the most secure there is, so long as you're keeping it somewhere fireproof, basically, and somewhere you won't lose it. But there are apps to help us with. But I think the key thing is have lists. Just have list after list after list, both of what you have done. I have a list at the back of my physical notebook, for example, which is just questions. It's literally, and it goes back pages and pages now. So as I'm researching, as I'm reading, as my reporters are coming to me with ideas, I get questions. It's just a list of questions. So, just listen. And so, yes, technology can help, but the main thing is, if you're a reporter, you're a writer, write this stuff down because you will forget it. And so long as, and then basically find something that works for you. Neela's tip of an organized colleague definitely helps. And if you're working with a bigger organization, they'll often have an editorial assistant, or they'll have an editor who can maybe help you with that as well. But the main thing is to write these things down. And for me, that's basically always in list form.
Yeah, and Trello works in a list form, right? And you get to organize them. And so that's why I really like it. And then my younger reporters are more organized than I am. So they'll color code it, like, this person has been contacted, this person gave an interview, this person said no, and it's color coded. I mean, that is the level of, like, obsessive organizing that they do, but it's really useful. We can just look at it and say, okay, that's done. This is moved on. You can move things among columns. So it's great. It's just keeping lists, but on a, not in your notebook, but on the screen, and you can share it with people in your team.
Yeah, we use Google Docs all the time. They work great. But for me, that I am a very unorganized person, I try to internalize everything and think about the questions I am going to be put in the world in notice. So my internal own copybook is always alive.
I'll move on to the next question. And this is a question that I know Neela is not going to like, but I think precisely that's why I have to ask this question. And this is a question from Seema Prasad, who's she's a current fellow with us now at Climate Tracker. So the question, Neela, is who was your first source to uncover the pollution caused by Aizen? I think she refers to the research.
I'm sorry, who was say that again? Who was, because I have air conditioning running.
The question is, who was your first source to uncover the Aizen story?
Right, so we never talk about where we get our documents from, if that's what you're getting at, Seema, because this is what I mean by protecting people, right? These are people who rely on Exxon for pensions and healthcare. In our country, we don't have universal healthcare, obviously. And they are like my parents, and I'm not going to ever hurt them, and I'm not going to talk about where we got the documents until they're gone from this earth. I will tell you how it all started. And the way it started was with a question that our publisher had about what did big fossil fuel companies know about climate change, and when did they know it, and can we find scientists and whistleblowers to talk about it? And we thought he was nuts. Like, we will never find people to talk about this. This will never work. One of my colleagues spoke to a government scientist, this guy named Michael McCracken, about, yeah, so you worked on climate change in the government for a long time. Did you ever interact with private companies? Because in the States, they often work together because there's so much expertise at private companies. And he said, yeah, Exxon was actually doing interesting work in the 80s. And that was really illuminating to us because the work that we were looking at where scientists knew things was in the 90s at oil and gas companies. And so all of a sudden the timetable shifted to the 80s and Exxon was the only one. So that came up. And then how we actually start to find names was in a document. So I was on a listserv of climate journalists and scientists and communicators. And someone shared a digitized transcript of a congressional hearing on climate change from the late 1970s. Now, it was actually a decade later that one of our top scientists, Jim Hansen, spoke about climate change. So I was like, what the hell is Congress doing talking about climate change 10 years earlier? It's as if like we'd be talking about, I don't know, net neutrality in 1995 or something. It was very odd. So I was truly, it was like 9:30 at night. I was in my bedroom. I was procrastinating. And I started to just go through this PDF to see if there were representatives from oil and gas companies there. And so I searched under all these names, Chevron, Shell, nobody. And then the last name I put in was Exxon and a name popped up, right? So this guy's name is Henry Shaw. I quickly found out Henry Shaw was dead, but that he was, he'd authored this paper that was also in the public realm, also found online, with other people from Exxon about research that an Exxon tanker was doing about about carbon being trapped in the oceans. And they were doing this research in the late 70s. So this, of course, blew my mind and I shared it with my colleagues. So that's how it started. And it's through that we talked to people. They gave us names. We went to archives. We found like little tiny documents at archives that gave us more names. And that's how it went. But where exactly we got the documents, you can hear that once these people are no longer alive. So anyway, that's
wow, what a story, Neela. I admire this story so much, and I was editing a page on climate change at the time the story came about, and I published it, I reproduced it in Argentina, and I don't think anybody understood the importance of it at the time.
We didn't either. Like, I did it and I was as a journalist, I was very excited to find this stuff, but as all of you know, there are great investigations that get done and nothing happens, right? I mean, I've seen it in my career in terrific investigations. And we're, Inside Climate is tiny. At that time, there might've been a dozen people and you just think like, well, there'll be some activists and some scientists who are angry about it and we'll move on. And we didn't. And it's, it still surprises me. I don't know if I'll ever do something like that in my career, but it was really documents and people and documents and protecting people, like really earning their trust and protecting them. So.
Okay, we'll have one more question from Matt and one more question from Marina. And after that, we'll close the session. If you have asked any other question that isn't going to be asked, we will try to get your questions answered and publish them next week. So a question for Matt. Did your bank investigation tie into the work done by ICIJ with the finance files? But this question is from Christian Zagur.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The short answer is no. I only tied into it in as much as it provides fantastic context and provides some information, but it wasn't a direct collaboration. But that is actually a great example of where these kind of collaborations can come into play. And we have done a lot of things where, for example, we've come across data sets and we've come across information that is just too big for us or for a single set of journalists to handle. And I think, as I said right at the top of my presentation, that's one of the things I like most about this beat, really, is that there's a real desire, a really real community desire to work on this stuff and share the credit, which you don't always see. That's quite rare in a media space. So, yeah, I mean, if anyone ever comes across that stuff where they think they found something that is too big for just them, then trust me, there'll be plenty of hands who will be willing to help.
Thank you, Matt. And last question is for Marina. And this is from Carolina, who I think is not in the call anymore, but I'm thinking I know who she is. Caro Gil Posse, who I think you probably know as well. Yeah, she was here before. I saw her before. Yeah, she has been a panelist in one of our one of these webinars last year on health and climate change. Sorry, I will shut up now. Marina, considering your experience and your knowledge about newsrooms, do you think that outstanding climate investigative journalism in Latin America today is only possible outside mainstream media? Or is it possible to think about changing the narrative also within the major news outlets? Very good question.
Well, that's a complicated and important question. I see that newsrooms in Argentina, at least, and I think it's the case for the whole Latin American region, are shrinking because the journalistic model that they have, it doesn't work anymore. So I am kind of skeptical about changing narratives in big media. What we are trying to do with Periodistas por Planeta is to replicate the model that Matt has with DeSmog, is to produce stories in our sites and then give them for free to mainstream media so they can use. And eventually, journalists will have to catch up with reality and to see that climate change is an intersectional story, as you mentioned in your introduction. But it would take a while for mainstream media to catch up. So, yeah, it's gonna be difficult.
Thank you very much, Marina. We're gonna leave it here. Thank you very much for all of your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of them. There's still a few. There are really good questions. I've seen a couple of them here, 3, 4, 5 more. They still keep coming in. So I will bug our panelists with these questions during this week, and hopefully we'll get a line or two for each of them and post them next week in the web post. Until then, thank you very much again. Thank you, Matt, Neela, Marina, for being here. It has been incredibly insightful and inspiring. And thank you all of you for being here too. This was a very, very exciting and fantastic session. And I'm very happy to say that we broke a record in registrants, and I think also in participants in these webinars that, as I said, happen at the end of each month, different topics, different experts. So keep checking our our social networks and keep informed. And you have my email, it's in the chat. So write it down before we close this, because then it will be gone. Santiago@climatetracker.org. You can also find me on Twitter, and my direct messages are open. So if you have any questions and you don't find my email address anymore, you can find me. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a very good day, afternoon, or evening. And yeah, see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye.